The air above the Euphrates River in November 2004 tasted like pulverized concrete, raw sewage, and unburned cordite. If you stood on the outskirts of the city and listened, you did not hear the chaotic, random gunfire of a disorganized insurgency, but rather the methodical, chilling silence of a fortress waiting for a siege. This was not a peacekeeping mission, and this was not a hearts and minds campaign. This was Operation Phantom Fury, the Second Battle of Fallujah, and it was about to become the most savage, block by block, room by room, urban meat grinder the United States military had faced since the ruins of Hue City in 1968. We are talking about a city roughly 3 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers long, packed with 200,000 structures, narrow alleyways, and an entrenched, fanatical enemy who had spent 6 uninterrupted months turning every single doorway into a potential kill zone. Welcome to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the hardware, and the brutal realities of military history. If you want to understand what it actually takes to breach a fortified city, how combined arms maneuver works in an environment where the enemy is above, below, and behind you, hit that subscribe button right now. To understand why the United States Marine Corps and the United States Army had to unleash hell on this specific patch of Iraqi dirt, you cannot just look at the events of 2004. You have to look at the geography, the culture, and the catastrophic strategic missteps that built the perfect storm. Fallujah sits in Al-Anbar province, about 40 miles west of Baghdad, anchored on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River. For decades under Saddam Hussein, this city was a hub for the Ba'ath Party elite, military officers, and intelligence operatives. It was a proud, fiercely independent tribal stronghold, heavily reliant on the smuggling routes that ran west into Syria and Jordan. When the US invasion toppled Saddam in the spring of 2003, Fallujah initially remained quiet, untouched by the heavy bombing that leveled parts of Baghdad. But then came May 23, 2003, and Coalition Provisional Authority Order No. 2, signed by Paul Bremer. With a single stroke of a pen, the entire Iraqi army and security apparatus were disbanded, stripping 400,000 men of their salaries, their pensions, and their pride, but leaving them with their assault rifles. In Fallujah, a city dominated by former military men, this was not just an administrative error, it was a declaration of war. Over the next year, the city became a magnet for unemployed, angry Ba'athist officers, disenfranchised Sunni tribesmen, and a new, far more lethal element pouring in across the porous Syrian border. That element was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, spearheaded by the Jordanian-born terrorist mastermind Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi did not just want to bleed the Americans, he wanted to drag the entire country into a sectarian civil war, and he needed a sanctuary to build his bomb factories. The boiling point arrived on March 31, 2004. 4 American private security contractors working for Blackwater were driving through Fallujah when they were ambushed, murdered, burned, and their charred bodies were hung from the green iron girders of a bridge spanning the Euphrates. The images were broadcast across the globe, triggering a visceral, immediate political demand for retribution in Washington. The military response was Operation Vigilant Resolve, the First Battle of Fallujah, launched in April 2004. Marine battalions cordoned off the city and began a methodical, violent push into the insurgent strongholds. They were winning the tactical fight, but the enemy was winning the information war. Al Jazeera broadcast images of civilian casualties. The Iraqi Governing Council threatened to collapse, and the political establishment in Washington panicked. Against the furious objections of Marine commanders on the ground, the offensive was halted, and the Marines were ordered to pull back. What followed was a strategic disaster of epic proportions. The city was handed over to the Fallujah Brigade, a hastily assembled local Iraqi security force that immediately dissolved, handing their American-supplied weapons, radios, and vehicles directly to the insurgents. For the next 6 months, from May to November 2004, the US military was forced to sit outside the city limits and watch as Fallujah transformed into a terrorist Disneyland. How do you take a city of 300,000 people when every single house is a potential claymore mine? You don't. You empty it first, and then you bring the hammer. Throughout the late summer and early fall, the coalition dropped leaflets, broadcast radio messages, and conducted shaping operations, urging the civilian population to flee. By November, the population of Fallujah had dropped from 300,000 to an estimated 30,000 non-combatants, leaving behind a hardened core of 3,000 to 4,000 dedicated insurgent fighters. This enemy force was a lethal hybrid. You had the religious fanatics of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, foreign fighters from Chechnya, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, who had come to Fallujah specifically to die in a holy war. But you also had the secular, highly trained former officers of Saddam's Republican Guard, men who understood fields of fire, indirect artillery support, and defensive engineering. They had 6 months to prepare the battlefield, and they turned the city into a 3-dimensional labyrinth of death. The insurgents utilized a tactic known as mouse-holing, using sledgehammers and explosives to knock holes through the interior walls of attached row houses. This allowed them to move entire blocks without ever stepping foot into the streets, completely negating American aerial surveillance. They buried hundreds of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, deep under the asphalt, linking them with command wires to remote detonation points. They rigged entire houses to blow, chaining propane tanks to 155mm artillery shells in the living rooms, waiting for a Marine squad to kick in the front door. They fortified the minarets of the city's famous mosques, using them as elevated sniper hides, knowing that the Americans would hesitate to drop ordnance on religious sites. Their weapons were Soviet-era, but devastatingly effective in close quarters. The standard insurgent carried an AK-47 or a PKM belt-fed machine gun. But the real threat to coalition armor was the RPG-7, specifically loaded with PG-7 VR tandem charge warheads designed to defeat reactive armor. They bolted 14.5mm DSHK heavy machine guns to the beds of Toyota pickup trucks, creating highly mobile anti-aircraft and anti-infantry platforms. They established interlocking fields of fire down the long, straight avenues of the Jolan and Askari districts, creating fatal funnels that would shred any dismounted infantry attempting to cross. To break this fortress, the coalition assembled a devastating array of combat power under the command of Lieutenant General John Sattler of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and Major General Richard Natonsky of the 1st Marine Division. The assault force was divided into 2 primary regimental combat teams, RCT-1 and RCT-7, totaling roughly 10,000 US personnel and 2,000 Iraqi security forces. RCT-1, commanded by Colonel Michael Shupp, was anchored by the 3rd Battalion 1st Marines and the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines. RCT-7, commanded by Colonel Craig Tucker, included the 1st Battalion 8th Marines and the 1st Battalion 3rd Marines. But the Marines knew that light infantry alone would be bled dry in these concrete canyons, just as they were during the Battle of Hue City in Vietnam, where Marines had to take houses yard by yard with nothing but rifles and grenades. General Natonsky needed heavy metal, and he got it from the United States Army. Attached to the Marine regiments were two mechanized Army behemoths, Task Force 27 Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rainey, and Task Force 22 Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Pete Newell. This integration of Army heavy armor with Marine light infantry was a masterstroke of combined arms doctrine. The Army brought the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank, a 70-ton Apex Predator powered by a 1,500-horsepower Honeywell gas turbine engine. The Abrams was wrapped in depleted uranium mesh and Chobham composite armor, making it nearly impervious to standard small arms and light rocket fire from the front. Its 120mm M256 smoothbore gun was loaded not just with anti-tank sabos, but with high-explosive anti-tank, or heat rounds, and multi-purpose anti-tank, or MPAT rounds, capable of turning a concrete-reinforced sniper hide into a cloud of pink mist and dust from 2 miles away. Alongside the Abrams rolled the M2A3 Bradley fighting vehicle, a 30-ton armored personnel carrier packing a 25mm M242 Bushmaster chain gun. The Bushmaster could fire up to 200 rounds per minute, cycling between armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds and high-explosive incendiary tracer rounds, perfectly designed to chew through the brick and mortar walls of Fallujah's residential blocks. The infantrymen stacked behind these armored shields were carrying an average of 80 to 100 pounds of gear. The standard Marine rifleman carried the M16A4 service rifle, equipped with the Trijicon ACOG, a 4-power optical sight that allowed for precise headshots down long alleyways. Firepower at the squad level was augmented by the M249 squad automatic weapon, spitting 56mm suppressive fire, and the M203 underbarrel grenade launcher. For bunker busting, the Marines carried the SMAW, the shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapon, an 83mm rocket launcher specifically designed to blast entry holes into fortified compounds. Above the city, the airspace was completely dominated by coalition air power. F/A-18 Hornets and F-16 Fighting Falcons loitered at 20,000 feet, armed with 500-pound GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, guided by GPS coordinates called in by Joint Terminal Attack Controllers on the ground. When the sun went down and the temperature plummeted from the daytime highs into the bitter, bone-chilling 40s, the AC-130 Spectre gunships would take over. Orbiting like angels of death, these heavily modified cargo planes carried a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a 25mm Gatling gun, using infrared sensors to track the body heat of insurgents moving across the rooftops. The logistical footprint required to sustain this violence was staggering. At Camp Fallujah and surrounding staging areas, logisticians stockpiled millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, thousands of 155mm artillery shells for the M198 howitzer batteries, and massive reserves of whole blood and medical supplies. They established forward aid stations and armored ambulance routes, knowing that the survival rate of a wounded Marine depended entirely on the golden hour, the 60 minutes between the moment a bullet shattered bone and the moment a surgeon clamped the artery. When you look at the force ratio and the terrain, the historical parallels are undeniable. In October 1944, during the Battle of Aachen, the US Army had to push Sherman tanks into narrow, rubble-choked European streets to blast fanatical Nazi defenders out of fortified basements. In February 1945, during the Battle of Manila, American forces learned the hard way how reinforced concrete buildings could absorb massive amounts of artillery while the enemy inside continued to fight to the death. Fallujah was going to demand the same horrific toll, the same primal, terrifying combat where survival is measured in inches and where a single doorway can swallow an entire squad. By the first week of November, the perimeter was sealed. The British Black Watch Regiment had deployed to the south to prevent insurgents from escaping the net, while the Iraqi 36th Commando Battalion prepared to take the local hospital on the peninsula to prevent the enemy from using it as a propaganda command center. The rules of engagement were crystal clear. The city had been designated a free fire zone for anyone displaying hostile intent. The men of the 1st Marine Division and the 1st Infantry Division sat in their staging areas, checking their weapons, writing letters home, and waiting for the word. The sky above the city was already glowing orange from the continuous, earth-shattering impacts of the preparatory artillery barrages. The cordon was locked, the shaping fires had done all they could do, and the moment of truth had finally arrived. The breach was imminent, and the gates of hell were about to be kicked wide open. On the evening of November 8, 2004, the sky above Fallujah tore open. The preliminary bombardment was not just a display of firepower. It was a calculated, synchronized dismantling of the city's northern defensive perimeter. Marine 155mm howitzers, Army Paladins, and circling AC-130 gunships pounded the railroad embankment that marked the northern edge of the city, turning insurgent mortar pits and sniper hides into smoking craters. But artillery cannot secure ground, and you cannot bomb a city into submission when the enemy is buried deep in the concrete. To get the infantry into the city, the coalition first had to breach the railroad tracks, an elevated berm heavily seeded with anti-tank mines, tripwires, and pre-registered mortar targets. How do you carve a safe path through a minefield when the enemy is actively shooting at you with heavy machine guns? You do not send men with metal detectors, you send a rocket dragging a rope of high explosives. Combat engineers rolled forward in armoured vehicles to deploy the M58 mine-clearing line charge, commonly known as the Miklik. The Miklik fires a rocket that pulls a 350-foot line packed with over 1,700 pounds of C4 explosive across the obstacle. When it detonates, the sheer overpressure creates a massive shockwave, sympathetically detonating buried mines and clearing a lane 8 meters wide and 100 meters long. As the shockwaves from the Mikliks rattled the teeth of Marines waiting in their assault amphibious vehicles, the heavy earth movers moved in. The military deployed the D9 armoured bulldozer, a 100,000-pound Israeli-designed mechanical monster wrapped in slat armour and bulletproof glass. These bulldozers ground forward under heavy fire, dropping their massive blades to punch through the railroad berm, pushing aside wrecked cars, concrete barriers, and unexploded ordnance to create assault lanes for the Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. By 1900 hours, the breach was open, and the mechanized columns of Task Force 27 Cavalry and Task Force 22 Infantry poured into the breach, leading the Marine Infantry regiments into the Jolan and Askari districts. The moment the assault elements crossed the berm, the environment turned against them. The temperature plummeted into the bitter, bone-chilling 40s, and a cold, driving rain began to fall over Al-Anbar province. The rain turned the pulverized dust of Fallujah into a thick, sucking mud that jammed weapons, coated optics, and added 10 pounds of dead weight to the boots of every infantryman. Because the coalition had completely severed the power grid to deny the insurgents the ability to use electrically command-detonated IEDs, the city was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The Americans owned the night, operating with PVS-14 monocular night vision goggles and thermal optics, but the heavy rain degraded the ambient light and washed out thermal signatures. The initial push into the Jolan district, a labyrinth of narrow, winding alleyways in the northwest, immediately revealed the lethal brilliance of the insurgent defensive plan. The enemy did not stand and fight in the open streets because they knew that exposing themselves meant instant death from the chain guns of the Bradleys or the thermal sights of the Abrams tanks. Instead, they fought from deep inside the residential blocks, utilizing a brutal, medieval style of urban warfare. The standard Fallujah house was a fortress by design, built with thick cinder-block walls, surrounded by a high courtyard wall, and secured by heavy steel gates. Insurgents would barricade the front gates, heavily sandbag the interior windows, and knock small, fist-sized murder holes through the exterior walls. When a Marine squad pushed down a street, they were not just taking fire from the rooftops, they were taking grazing fire at knee level from hidden bunkers inside the living rooms. This created a tactical nightmare that mirrored the horrific beachhead landings of Tarawa in 1943, where Marines were trapped in fatal funnels, taking enfilading fire from mutually supporting pillboxes. In Fallujah, the fatal funnel was not a beach. It was every single alleyway, every single courtyard, and every single stairwell. To survive, the infantry had to completely rewrite their close-quarters battle doctrines on the fly. The standard Marine issue weapon was the M16A4, a phenomenal rifle for engaging targets at 500 yards in the open desert, but an absolute liability inside a 10-foot room. The M16A4 features a 20-inch barrel and a fixed stock, making it nearly 40 inches long. When a point man tried to aggressively pivot around a corner or clear a narrow hallway, the long barrel would telegraph his movement, or worse, physically snag on the doorframe. Marines were forced to adapt, short-stocking their rifles by resting the buttstock over their shoulders to compress their profile, sacrificing recoil control just to fit through the doorways. How do you clear a heavily fortified house when the front door is wired to a 155mm artillery shell and a PKM machine gun is pre-sighted on the hallway? You do not use the door, and you do not ask politely. The coalition forces quickly abandoned the standard bottom-up clearing method, realizing that entering the ground floor of an insurgent stronghold was a guaranteed death sentence. Instead, they adopted a top-down clearing method, utilizing the heavy armor and explosive assets at their disposal. When a squad took fire from a house, they would immediately pull back and call up an Abrams tank or a Bradley. The Abrams would rotate its turret, elevate its 120mm smoothbore gun, and fire a high-explosive anti-tank round directly into the reinforced concrete wall from a range of 50 yards. The sheer concussive blast of a 120mm gun firing inside a narrow city street is catastrophic. The overpressure alone would shatter windows for blocks, blow out the eardrums of unbuttoned infantrymen, and turn the interior of the target house into a blinding cloud of pulverized brick, smoke, and severed limbs. If heavy armor was not available, the Marines relied on a terrifying new weapon in their arsenal, the SMAW-NE. The shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapon had long been used for bunker busting, but the NE variant stood for Novel Explosive, a thermobaric warhead. When a thermobaric rocket penetrates a building, it does not just explode with shrapnel, it disperses an aerosolized cloud of highly combustible fuel, and then immediately ignites it. The resulting detonation creates a massive, sustained overpressure wave that travels through the hallways, crushing internal organs, rupturing lungs, and sucking the oxygen out of the enclosed space. It allowed a single Marine to instantly neutralize an entire houseful of entrenched fighters without ever having to step foot inside. Once the walls were breached or the roof was compromised, assault elements would use ladders to climb onto the flat roofs, drop fragmentation grenades down the stairwells, and clear the structure from the top down. This brutal, methodical destruction was entirely necessary because the insurgents had learned the lessons of the Battle of Ortona in 1943. In Ortona, Canadian troops fighting the German army invented the tactic of mouse-holing, blasting through the interior walls of attached row houses to avoid the deadly kill zones of the open streets. The insurgents in Fallujah used this exact same tactic, moving seamlessly from block to block, appearing behind American lines to ambush medical evacuation convoys or resupply trucks. They utilized complex L-shaped ambushes, waiting for an armored column to pass before firing volleys of RPG-7s into the thinner rear armor of the vehicles. The RPG-7, particularly when loaded with a tandem charge warhead, was a lethal threat to the Bradley fighting vehicles and the amphibious assault vehicles. To counter this, the mechanized infantry of Task Force 2-2 and Task Force 2-7 operated in a tight, symbiotic relationship with the dismounted Marines and soldiers. The infantry provided the eyes, scanning the rooftops and the dark alleyways for the telltale flash of an RPG launch, while the armor provided the overwhelming, immediate, suppressive fire. The tanks were equipped with an infantry telephone on the rear fender, allowing the squad leader on the ground to plug a headset directly into the tank's intercom system. Under heavy fire, a Marine could pick up that phone and direct the tank commander to put a 120mm shell through a specific window on a specific floor, delivering surgical destruction in the midst of total chaos. The logistics required to keep this armored spearhead moving through the city were a nightmare of blood and sweat. Tanks consume gas turbine fuel at an astronomical rate, and infantry squads were burning through 5.56mm ammunition and hand grenades faster than the supply lines could push them forward. Logistics convoys, driving unarmored or hastily up-armored Humvees and 7-ton trucks, had to run the gauntlet down the main avenues, taking heavy sniper and mortar fire just to deliver pallets of water and ammunition to the forward operating bases. These supply routes also served as the primary medical evacuation channels. When a Marine took a sniper round to the chest or had his legs shattered by an IED, the corpsman had to pack the wounds with combat gauze, apply tourniquets in the dark, and load the casualty onto the back of a Bradley or a Humvee. The drivers then had to navigate back through the rubble-strewn, cratered streets at top speed, praying they did not hit a pressure plate mine on the way to the surgical shock trauma platoon. By the night of November 10th, the sheer ferocity of the close-quarters combat reached a horrifying crescendo. In the Askari district, Task Force 2-2 infantry was pushing hard to clear a series of fortified housing blocks. Staff Sergeant David Bellavia, a squad leader with the 1st Infantry Division, found his platoon pinned down in the street by heavy machine gun fire originating from a darkened residential compound. Knowing his men were being chewed up in the open, Bellavia grabbed an M249 squad automatic weapon and charged into the courtyard of the house alone. He breached the front door, stepping into a pitch-black hallway filled with the choking dust of drywall and the smell of raw sewage. What followed was a brutal, intimate nightmare of hand-to-hand combat that earned Bellavia the Medal of Honor. In the dark, he engaged multiple insurgents at point-blank range, killing one with his rifle, wounding another, and then physically clearing the rooms one by one. When his ammunition ran dry and his weapon malfunctioned, he engaged an insurgent in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle in a bedroom, ultimately neutralizing the threat with a combat knife. This was not a war of grand strategic sweeping maneuvers. This was a war of desperate men killing each other over a few square feet of blood-slicked tile. It was the savage reality of urban combat, mirroring the horrific room-by-room meat grinder of Stalingrad in 1942, where entire squads were wiped out trying to secure a single staircase. Despite the heavy casualties and the grueling pace, the combined arms juggernaut of the coalition forces was grinding the insurgency into dust. By November 11th, the lead elements of the Marine regiments and the Army task forces had pushed south, reaching phase line Fran, the major multi-lane thoroughfare known as Highway 10 that bisected Fallujah from east to west. Reaching the highway was supposed to be the hardest part of the operation, the culmination of the northern assault. The commanders halted their armored columns along the highway to consolidate their lines, resupply their exhausted infantry, and prepare for the final push. Looking south across the wide expanse of Highway 10, the city seemed eerily quiet, completely devoid of the heavy resistance they had just fought through in the Jolan. But the silence was a trap, and the insurgents had not been defeated in the north, they had simply executed a tactical withdrawal. They had pulled the Americans exactly where they wanted them, drawing them away from the wider avenues and into the densely packed ancient labyrinth of the Shuhada district in the south. The real fortress was waiting just across the asphalt, and the bloodiest days of Operation Phantom Fury had not even begun. Crossing phase line Fran was not a victory lap, it was stepping into a meticulously engineered meat grinder. South of Highway 10, the urban geography of Fallujah fundamentally changed. The wide, symmetrical avenues of the northern districts gave way to the ancient, claustrophobic and chaotic layout of the Shuhada and Nazal neighborhoods. The streets here were too narrow for the 70-ton Abrams tanks to traverse without scraping their side skirts against the concrete walls, severely limiting the mobility of the heavy armor that had shielded the infantry in the north. The insurgents knew this, and they had deliberately ceded the northern half of the city to draw the American forces into this suffocating subterranean labyrinth. They had spent months digging spider holes and connecting basements with reinforced tunnels, creating a defensive network that completely negated the coalition's overwhelming advantage in aerial surveillance and satellite imagery. You can put a Predator drone at 15,000 feet with a thermal camera that can read a license plate, but it cannot see a Chechen sniper sitting in a windowless basement with a PKM machine gun. This was the brutal reality of the intelligence war in Fallujah. The high-tech, multi-billion-dollar signals intelligence apparatus of the United States military was rendered completely useless by an enemy who communicated using handwritten notes carried by runners running through sewers. When the Marines of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines pushed into this southern sector, they immediately ran into the most fanatical, hardened core of the insurgency. These were not local militiamen fighting for a paycheck. These were foreign fighters who had come to Al-Anbar province with the express purpose of dying in a holy war, and they had no intention of retreating any further. On November 13th, this collision of immovable force and fanatical resistance resulted in one of the most savage close-quarters engagements in modern Marine Corps history, an event simply known as the Hell House. A squad of Marines had pushed into a seemingly abandoned residential compound, kicking in the front door and stepping into the dark, enclosed courtyard. It was a textbook fatal funnel. The insurgents had heavily sandbagged the interior stairwells, knocked murder holes through the floorboards of the second story, and waited until the entire squad was inside the house before opening fire with belt-fed machine guns and fragmentation grenades. The initial volley instantly pinned down the squad, wounding several Marines and trapping them in a crossfire where the bullets were literally coming from the ceiling. How do you extract bleeding men from a concrete box when the enemy holds the high ground inside the very same building? You do not call for an airstrike because a 500-pound JDAM would vaporize your own men. And you do not wait for a hostage negotiation. You send in more Marines to violently pry them out. First Sergeant Bradley Casal, alongside a small reaction force, breached the house to rescue the trapped squad. What followed was a horrific, point-blank gunfight in pitch-black, smoke-filled corridors that mirrored the most desperate moments of the Battle of Hue in 1944. During the Pacific Campaign, Marines had to use flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear Japanese defenders out of the subterranean limestone caves of the Umabrogal Pocket because artillery could not penetrate the rock. In the Hell House of Fallujah, the concrete walls were the new limestone caves. First Sergeant Casal fought his way into a room to shield a severely wounded Marine, absorbing a staggering 7 AK-47 rounds and 43 pieces of shrapnel from a grenade blast. He lost roughly 60% of his blood, yet he refused medical evacuation until the other wounded men were extracted, maintaining security with his service pistol while bleeding out on the floor. This single engagement encapsulated the entire tactical nightmare of the southern push. To clear these entrenched bunkers, the coalition forces had to rely on highly controversial but devastatingly effective munitions. White phosphorus, colloquially known by artillerymen as shake and bake, was fired from 155mm howitzers to create massive smoke screens, but its secondary effect was terrifying. When white phosphorus detonates, it scatters burning wedges of chemical agent that ignite upon contact with oxygen, burning at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and flushing insurgents out of their deep spider holes and into the kill zones of the waiting infantry. The strategic and tactical lessons learned in these southern blocks completely rewrote modern military doctrine. Following the disastrous Russian assault on Grozny in 1994, where unsupported columns of mechanized armor were annihilated by Chechen rebels with RPGs, Western military theorists had declared that heavy tanks had no place in urban warfare. Fallujah proved them dead wrong. The Battle of Fallujah demonstrated that heavy armor is absolutely vital in a city fight, provided it is intimately integrated with dismounted infantry who can protect the tank's blind spots. The M1A2 Abrams became a 70-ton sniper rifle, using its thermal optics to spot body heat through thin walls, and its 120mm main gun to surgically remove sniper hides. But this integration placed an unbelievable, back-breaking strain on the logistical supply chain. We often talk about the romance of tactics, but amateurs talk tactics while professionals study logistics. To keep this war machine moving forward, the supply battalions had to accomplish a miracle of modern military economics. A single mechanized infantry battalion in heavy combat burns through thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, tens of thousands of rounds of 5.56mm ammunition, and hundreds of artillery shells every single day. Every bullet, every bandage, and every bottle of water had to be trucked in from Kuwait, driven up the heavily mined route Tampa to Baghdad, and then pushed into the active combat zone of Fallujah. The economic asymmetry of this conflict was staggering when you look at the raw numbers. The United States military was dropping $25,000 GPS-guided bombs onto $500 cinderblock houses to kill insurgents carrying $200 AK-47s. It was a war of absolute financial attrition. On the medical front, the logistics of survival were equally demanding. The military established forward resuscitative surgical suites just outside the city limits, essentially bringing the emergency room directly to the battlefield. This drastically reduced the time it took to get a wounded Marine from the point of injury to a surgical table, resulting in the highest survival rate for combat casualties in the history of warfare up to that point. But surviving the physical wounds was only half the battle, as the sheer overpressure of thermobaric weapons, tank guns, and constant IED blasts left thousands of veterans with invisible, lingering traumatic brain injuries. By the end of November, the heavy combat operations began to taper off, and the city was officially declared secure, though isolated pockets of resistance would require clearing operations well into December. When the smoke finally cleared, the butcher's bill was laid bare on the table. 95 Americans were killed in action, and over 560 were severely wounded. The insurgent losses were catastrophic, with an estimated 1,200 to 2,000 killed and another 1,500 captured. The city of Fallujah itself was effectively destroyed, with over 60% of its buildings heavily damaged or completely leveled. When you look at the sheer structural devastation, the only accurate historical comparison is the Battle of Manila in 1945. In Manila, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had to use point-blank artillery to blast fanatical Japanese naval infantry out of reinforced concrete government buildings, reducing the Pearl of the Orient to a smoldering graveyard. Fallujah suffered the exact same fate, becoming a desolate wasteland of pulverized concrete, twisted rebar, and feral dogs. Politically, the battle was a Pyrrhic victory. Tactically, the United States military completely annihilated al-Qaeda in Iraq's primary stronghold, denying them the bomb factories and the sanctuary they needed to operate freely. It proved that no insurgent force on Earth could stand toe-to-toe with a fully integrated American combined arms assault. But strategically, the destruction of Fallujah alienated a massive portion of the Sunni population, providing a powerful propaganda tool for the insurgency that would fuel the fires of sectarian violence for years to come. What happens when you have to completely destroy a city in order to save it? You win the battle, but you plant the seeds for the next war. The Second Battle of Fallujah stands as a grim, blood-soaked monument to the realities of modern urban combat, a testament to the unparalleled lethality of the American war machine, and a dark reminder of the heavy, unforgiving price paid by the infantrymen on the ground. War in the streets is not a surgical operation. It is a sledgehammer swung in the dark, where victory is measured in shattered rooms and empty bullet casings. Based on the tactical breakdown of this brutal siege, which element do you believe was the most critical factor in the coalition's victory? A. The overwhelming firepower and armor of the M1A2 Abrams tanks. B. The raw endurance and close-quarters adaptability of the Marine infantry. C. The absolute dominance of aerial bombardment and AC-130 gunships. Let us know your choice in the comments below, and defend your position.